Chapter 3. In this chapter, we'll learn to do various things. First, to determine acceptable and unacceptable degrees of vagueness in language. Secondly, to understand and identify types of ambiguity. Third, identify the problems generality causes in language. Fourth, to use definitions to increase precision and clarity and to influence attitudes. Then we'll look at understanding the types of definitions, and finally, acquire skills for writing an effective argumentative essay. And now we turn to the actual content of Chapter 3. Now, one of the problems that we face is a lack of clarity, and there are various examples of these. For example, a person may say something like this: I would generally expect that today in Washington, D.C., the probability of changes in the weather is highly uncertain, but we are monitoring the data in such a manner that we'll be able to update people on the changes that are important. Or another example: you know, when you give a man more money in his pocket, in this case a woman more money in her pocket, to expand a business, they build new buildings. And when someone builds a new building, somebody has got to come and build the building, and when the building expanded, it prevented additional opportunities for people to work. And of course that's rather unclear. Another example: they say that the money we had promised 3 years ago to be new money this year is not new money. We have not paid it yet, and it is old money versus new money. For me, new money is new money. If paying in $5 or $10, it's the same money. So these are examples of lacks of clarity. Now, the main causes of confusion, at least from the context that we're looking at, involves the following three things. First, excessive vagueness. Secondly, ambiguity. And third, terms that need to be defined. We'll be examining each of these, looking at vagueness, ambiguity, and then definitions. Now, one of the focuses of the chapter is the argumentative essay, and this is, obviously enough, an essay in which a person takes a position on an issue and, shockingly enough, supports it with argument. So this involves a statement of the issue, a statement of a person's position on that issue, and then arguments that support that position. Now, it can also include objections that are replied to, basically arguments against your position. And so one effective way to argue is to show that objections against your view are mistaken. Now, as it might be imagined, writing an argumentative essay, or any attempt at communication, is weakened by obscurity. Now, the first type of obscurity we'll look at is vagueness. Now, first we'll take a look at vague statements. The definition of a vague statement is this: it's a statement whose meaning is indistinct, imprecise, or otherwise lacks detail. To use my favorite crappy analogy here, experiencing a vague statement is rather like driving in a fog. Everything's sort of fuzzy and unclear, and you don't know exactly where you're going. Now, getting back to being a little more specific about vagueness, a phrase or a term is vague if the group of things to which it applies to has borderline cases. And good classic examples include, say, being rich. It's a fairly vague term. I mean, we know what it is to be like really rich, like Romney rich, or Donald Trump rich, or Bill Gates rich. But we also know what it's like to be, really poor. Like Professor Poor, or unemployed poor, or really, really poor. But there are sort of gray areas. For example, if a person makes, 100 billion a year, they're clearly rich. If a person makes, millions a year, they're clearly rich. But what if a person makes 250,000? Are they rich, or are they middle class? Is it 450,000? And so a term like rich is vague. Similarly, the classic example of baldness. Now, obviously, someone who has no hair whatsoever, obviously bald. Someone who's got lots and lots of hair, obviously not. But of course, there's fuzzy areas, literally in between, where someone, doesn't have all the hair they once had, but doesn't have, complete lack of hair. Now, what are some examples of vagueness? Well, suppose you're in a class, and all you're told about the paper is this: that the paper should be on a suitable topic. Obviously, that's pretty vague. What is a suitable topic? I mean, we know it's going to be a topic, it's going to be suitable, but we wouldn't know exactly what to write on. Another example, suppose you hear some advice about health saying you should get enough sleep if you want to feel better. Now, enough is rather vague. Is that 7 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours? We don't know. It's whatever enough is. Another example, politicians, of course, often deal in vagueness. They'll say things like, the tax increase will be fair. Now, exactly what does fair mean? Fair to who? What do they mean by that in this context? Now, vagueness occurs in many contexts. For example, in the case of law, vagueness often occurs and can have serious consequences. For example, we take the term, the phrase cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, obviously punishment is supposed to be, kind of mean because it's punishment, but what is exactly meant by being cruel or unusual? Or an expression like torture. That's kind of vague. As we saw, after 9/11, there was a use of enhanced interrogation techniques that some people regarded as torture. Others regarded it as merely enhanced interrogation. And so there's sort of a fuzzy area between, say, we might call like legitimate interrogation, and between that and, clear torture, there's kind of a fuzzy area. So the term torture is kind of vague. Now, in addition to being problematic in terms of the law, vagueness can also be fairly annoying. For example, if you get like vague directions to something. So if you ask like where a place is, and someone says, head down the road a ways until you hit the first major intersection. Take a right. When the street starts curving a bit to the left, take a left. The house is light colored and kind of near the turn. Now that's full, of course, of a variety of vague terms. So I mean, you might be able to find your way there, but obviously it's pretty fuzzy. Now, in addition to people being vague because of, say, just not being careful, vagueness can also be used to essentially avoid being precise. When someone doesn't want to be precise or cannot be precise, vagueness can be a way to sort of evade answers. Now, of course, in some cases, it can make the person look a little silly. For example, if someone asks a political candidate, and the question, what news sources do you get your information from? And the candidate answers, any of them. That's vague, but obviously doesn't make the candidate look particularly good. Or as another example, suppose a politician is asked, how does your health care plan differ from your opponent? And they reply back, mine does what is right for the American people in an effective and meaningful way. And of course that's very vague. What does that mean? What is it to be effective? What does it be to be meaningful? How much will it cost? How well will it work? You can also use vagueness when you want to sort of avoid taking a definite stance, say in social situations. For example, suppose you have a friend who's dating someone who is, pretty awful. And your friend asks you, your friend's pretty sensitive, and they say, what do you think of my new girlfriend? And one might say in reply, she's different. Because that's vague. It could be different nice, different bad, but it's sort of safer than taking a definite position. Now, vagueness, much like fog, comes in degrees. There's more vague, less vague, and basically being more precise means being less vague. Being less precise means being more vague. For example, if I say my taxes are higher than last year, that's more vague or vaguer than saying my taxes increased by 2%. Similarly, if someone says the paper is due near the middle of the semester, that's vaguer than the claim the paper is due on Wednesday of week 8 of the semester. Now, vagueness is in many ways unavoidable, but what is to be avoided is not all vagueness, because that would be perhaps impossible, but to avoid an undesirable amount or degree of vagueness. The mere fact that a claim is not as precise as it could be doesn't mean that it's not precise enough. So it's a matter of context, and often in a very practical sense. In other words, if you know what the person means and it's adequate for your purpose, then it's precise enough. If you don't, if it's too fuzzy, you don't know what they mean because it's too fuzzy, then it would be too vague for that purpose. Now, typically, people tend to be more vague than too precise. Although, of course, people could be too precise, go on and on with needless details. But in general, if you're sort of trying to decide, should I be like a bit more vague or should I be more precise? In general, it's probably better to err on the side of precision, because if you're more precise, then people can simply, ignore the extra information they don't need. To use a crappy analogy, it's kind of like thinking about how much money you might need when going to the store. It's when you go to buy something, it's better to have more money than you need than too little. The same with precision. In general, it's better to be a little bit too precise than not precise enough. Again, because if you're overly precise, you may bore people a little bit or give them too much information, but they can choose to sort of ignore that or not use that. Whereas if it's too vague, they're kind of at a loss. Now, as I mentioned before, whether a claim is too vague or not depends on the context. For example, suppose somebody says, the computer is broken. Now, if you're going to say, use a computer to print your paper, and you're told, by someone, well, the computer you're going to use is broken, that's precise enough. All you need to know is, well, I'm not going to be able to print my paper with that printer off that computer. Now, if you're talking to someone, who is supposed to be like an IT expert, and you're, paying them a lot to fix your computer, and all they can say is, it's broke, you'd expect a little more than that. So, what is precise enough depends on the context. To use another example, if someone says, I'm not feeling well, that's precise enough if someone is telling someone why they're not going to some sort of an event. But if someone is telling the doctor what's wrong with him, they just say to the doctor, well, I'm not feeling well, the doctor needs a little more than that to make a diagnosis. Now, some claims, interestingly or boringly enough, are so vague that it can be almost impossible to determine if they're true or not, because it's not even clear what they actually mean. For example, suppose an advertising blurb says, our new formula gets clothes brighter than bright. Now, I guess it's supposed to be something positive, but it's not clear what it would be to be brighter than bright. So to recap, something is vague means that it's indistinct, imprecise, or lacking in detail. And vagueness comes in degrees. And the amount of vagueness that you can accept depends on your purpose or context. So it might be too vague in one situation, maybe just right in another. So it's kind of like a Goldilocks porridge thing. Except in this case, what counts as just right depends on what you're looking for. And that leads us to the final bit about vagueness, which is relative words, which I sort of indicated before. For example, terms like bald and rich, those are relative terms. And by their very nature, in a way, they are vague because you don't know exactly, they don't have very precise meanings. But again, sometimes you don't need it to be precise. For example, if you're looking for like a professor, and there's two professors talking, and someone you say, well, which one is Dr. Jones? And the person says, well, he's the bald one. And there's a person with hair, and there's someone with less hair, quite a bit less hair. Then even though bald is pretty vague, that's precise enough for your purposes. That brings us to the end of vagueness, and we'll pick up next time with ambiguity.